And now to Cuba, where thousands marched across several cities yesterday in some of the biggest anti-government demonstrations on the island nation in decades. People took to the streets protesting food shortages and high prices as the country suffers through a crippling economic crisis, exacerbated by the pandemic. So Manuel Bojorquez is in Miami, where demonstrators also came out this weekend in a show of solidarity with Cuban protesters. Manny, good morning. What's going on?
Yeah, good morning to you. We're standing outside of Versailles restaurant. This is typically the epicenter of demonstrations and rallies here in Miami's Little Havana neighborhood, and last night was no different. Thousands came out here to support those protesters in Cuba, and while the demonstrations here may be commonplace, what's happening in Cuba is not only rare, but historic. Thousands of protesters gathered in communities around Havana and across the island nation, shouting freedom and we are not afraid. Although protests began peacefully, they soon took a more violent turn as police and special forces moved in later on to break up the demonstrations. President Miguel Díaz-Canel himself made an appearance at one protest and spoke with some of the citizens who confronted him. Demonstrators here say they are fed up by food shortages, rising prices, collapsing infrastructure, and the government's response to a rising number of COVID-19 infections. On Saturday, Cuba recorded nearly 7,000 new cases. On Cuban television, Díaz-Canel blamed the protest on the U.S. and its trade embargo for a severe impact on Cuba's recent economic downturn.
The Trump administration passed many more regulations, many more sanctions against it, which basically has cut off all income coming into Cuba.
Portia Siegelbaum is a CBS News producer based in Cuba.
I think the Biden administration, he at least said at the beginning he was going to review this policy and make changes, but nothing has happened.
Several politicians have expressed their support for the people of Cuba and those protesters, including Cuban-American Senator Marco Rubio. As one defector told our CBS Miami affiliate, seeing those protests was, quote, magical. Anne-Marie?
Well, speaking of that, do we know what the latest is on the ground in Cuba now?
That's something we will have to monitor. We don't know at this point whether those protests will be allowed to continue, as you saw that there are already government pushback against those demonstrations. So today will be a day to see maybe who has been arrested, how those people are being treated, whether the internet is being restored on the island because it was knocked out in several parts as those demonstrations were happening. So there are a lot of questions, of course, about what's happening there. But you can imagine that here in Miami, these people who have come out here to support those protesters may be out here again expressing their support.
Yeah, let me ask you about that. You know, you point out that the restaurant where you're at is sort of the epicenter, sort of the heartbeat of the Cuban community there. What was the atmosphere like when people were taking to the streets in Miami over the weekend?
Yeah, it was just teeming with people out here. Police had to actually shut down Calle Ocho, the main street that goes through Little Havana, because there were so many people here last night. Of course, everything peaceful, but doing everything they can to try to bring attention to the plight of those people in Cuba. Many of the people here not only have relatives there, many of them fled the island themselves, escaping the communist regime there. So they have a lot of passion attached to this. It's very personal and deeply ingrained in them that when they see just a sliver of protest on the island where dissent is not tolerated, they want to come out here and really just fan those flames to keep that message going out there.
So any response at all from U.S. officials? Has the Biden administration addressed the crisis or the sanctions originally imposed by the Trump administration, which, you know, as we heard from the correspondent there, is, or producer rather, is adding to the economic crisis?
That's right. That's one of the things we have not heard from the Biden administration is a solid or detailed plan about how to deal with Cuba. As you referenced there, the Trump administration rolled back many of the reopenings that had started under the Obama administration. So we're waiting to hear more from the Biden administration today. So far, we have not seen the president directly respond to the protests in Cuba. We have seen other officials with the State Department come out and say that they support the ability for people to gather peacefully, to demand freedom, and that they would decry any attempt by the Cuban regime to use violence to suppress those protests. So we're expecting possibly to hear more today from the Biden administration about not only how they view the protests that are currently happening there, but at some point people are going to start demanding a more solid plan, more details about how they will deal with Cuba.
So it's not surprising that the administration in Cuba would, blame the sanctions for the current economic crisis. But I think this tweet was sort of surprising from Cuba's Director General for U.S. Affairs. He slammed the U.S. State Department and its officials on Twitter. And the quote was, for promoting social and political instability in Cuba, and that Cuba is and will continue to be a peaceful country contrary to the U.S. Any reaction to that tweet?
Well, that's been kind of the line down in Cuba as far as the government there is concerned. They believe that many of these protesters are either being paid by people here in the United States or essentially being thrust out there on the streets by people in the United States who want to foment some social change there. But if you talk to anybody here in Miami, they'll tell you, no, these people are just fed up, and the pandemic has done nothing but worsen the situation there that many blame, of course, on the socialist policies of the island. So we'll like I said, we'll have to wait and see what additional responses come today from the U.S. government against not only what the regime may be carrying out right now on the island as far as any backlash for those protesters, but to see whether other protests do indeed happen today.
Indeed. Manny, thank you so much.
Thank you.